Hello, this is a tutorial for the one needle Kitchener bind off for double knitting flat, which makes the perfect accompaniment to the alternating two-colour invisible cast on which I've used here on this swatch, which as you can see just rolls around from one colour to the other without any unsightly knots, and it's really stretchy as well. This way of binding off matches that exactly, which makes it very good for scarves or pot holders or anything like that you're knitting with double knitting in the flat. So how do we do it? Let's have a little look at what a bind-off does. With Kitchener bind-off, if you were just to go ahead and graft these two sides of the fabric together, you'd end up with one side being one row higher than the other. The Kitchener graft adds another row of stitches to the front of your work, which would be uneven when left on its own. So how do we get around that? The first thing we want to do is to purl all of the stitches at the back. Many people would at this point separate the front and the back stitches onto two separate needles by slipping them onto a pair of needles and then working from that. We don't need to do it that way. All we need to do is taking the coloured yarn that we are using for the purl stitches, which in this case is white, and if you've been doing the slip stitch edging, you'll find that you've got this white yarn at the front of your work. All we need to do is we slip all the knit stitches and work all the purl stitches. So we're going to leave the blue yarn dangling where it is there, we don't need that at the moment. And we're going to slip the first knit stitch out of the way, and then I'm going to set up for purling how I purl. I'm an English knitter, but you can easily do this continental style as well, or whatever your preferred method of knitting is. And then we're going to purl that stitch there. Now the important thing about doing this is taking the yarn backwards and forwards between each stitch. We want to take the yarn to the back of the work before we then slip the next knit stitch. We're slipping these stitches because these are the stitches that are going to be worked in the Kitchener graft, so we're only working the purl stitches for the back. Then we bring the yarn to the front and purl as normal. So continue doing that all the way across the row, making sure that you take the yarn to the back, slip, yarn to the front, purl. Let's show that again. Yarn to the back, slip the knit stitch, yarn to the front, and purl the purl stitch. Keep doing that all the way across to the end of the row, and I'll join you when we get there. I've now reached the opposite end of the row. I've continued slipping the knit stitches with the yarn in back, bringing the yarn forward and purling the purl stitches with the white yarn all the way across to the very end of the row. What that's done is it's built up an extra row of purl stitches on the back, because the Kitchener graft is going to build up a row of stitches on the front and we want them to match. What you might want to do is stop your pattern one row earlier than it calls for in order to make this row count as the final row rather than adding one at the end. That's entirely up to you. I'm using circular needles to do this because it's so much easier than working on straights where you do have to slip things backwards and forwards, and here's why. Without turning the work, because we now want to work on the front rather than what we've just done on the back, I'm going to pull my circular needle and slide all of the stitches from one side to the other. That gets us back in position, ready to start working with the other yarn. The first yarn at this end, that's now done with. You can cut that, leaving enough of a tail to weave in as necessary. Now we're going to work with the knit side of the fabric with the same colour yarn as those stitches require. What I've done already is I've cut a tail and threaded that onto a tapestry needle. I've left enough of working yarn here to be probably 4 or 5 times in length the width of the piece of work that I'm grafting across. Maybe 5 times plus a little bit extra, just to be on the safe side. There's nothing worse than reaching towards the end and finding out you've run out of yarn and having to go back on everything. Undoing a Kitchener graft is not impossible, but it's not a fun thing. Believe me, I know from experience. So what do we do in order to work off one needle? Most people at this point would be slipping these stitches onto two separate needles, separating back and front and grafting the two sides of the fabric together. We can do that on one needle without needing a second needle at all, and here's how. There's a two-stage setup process, and that only gets done once right at the very beginning, and I'll show you those steps now. The first step is to go into the first stitch on the needle as if to purl, and pulling the yarn through, making sure it doesn't get tangled up in its own tails as it's just done there. Here we are. The second stage is to come from behind and come in between the two stitches, between the first and the second stitch. I'm not going through them at all, I'm just literally coming between them and then turning the point of the needle round so you can go into that second stitch as if to knit. Let me show you that again. Come from behind, come between the first and second stitch on the needle, and then wiggle the point of the needle round so you can go into it as if to purl. Sorry, as if to knit. And then you pull the yarn through, again making sure you don't catch any tails from the earlier part of the work. Pulling that yarn through, that is the setup. That's all there is to it. Now you're ready to go. So here's the repeat. Stage 1 is to go into stitch 1 on the needle as if to knit, slip it off and pull the yarn all the way through. I'm going to have to do something about these tails. Let's hold those out of the way. There we are, pull that nice and tight. Stage 2 is to go into the next knit stitch, not this purl stitch, but the next knit stitch on the needle, as if to purl, leaving all of those stitches on the needle this time, and pulling the working yarn through. Step 3 is to go into the first purl stitch on the needle, as if to purl, slipping it off as you do so. So you come in as if to purl, slip that stitch off, and then pull your yarn all the way through. And the next stage, and the final stage, is to come in again between the first and second stitches from behind there, just coming straight in between the two of them and going into that second stitch, which is a purl stitch, as if to knit. It is a purl stitch, but go in as if to knit. Leaving those on the needle, you then pull through. Those are the 4 stages. So let me show you that again right from the start. First stitch, as if to knit, slip off and pull through. Next knit stitch, as if to purl, which is the second stitch on the needle, and pull through. Then we're going into the first stitch on the needle, as if to purl, and slipping it off in the process, making sure it doesn't wrap around itself as we go along. There we go. Then coming in between the next two stitches and going into the purl stitch as if to knit and pull through. You can already see that that's separating itself from the needle as we go. Let's show you that one more time. Stitch 1 as if to knit, slip off and pull through. So that's knit, slip, into the next knit stitch as if to purl, leaving them on the needle, and pull through. Purl stitch as if to purl, slipping off and pulling through. That's the one that wants to wrap round itself. And then between the 2 stitches from behind, between and through the purl stitch as if to knit and pull through. I was breaking down all the stages individually to start with just to show you what they all were, but as you can see, doing it this way comes along much more quickly. Into knit, slip it off, into the next stitch as if to purl and pull through. Oops, there we are. Into purl, slip it off, between the 2 stitches and into the purl stitch as if to knit and pull through. What this is doing is giving us a very, very neat and tidy edge. As you can see, again, it's very, very stretchy depending on how much tension you put. It's quite interesting to try and get it's quite important, I should say, to try and get the tension with this graft the same as the stitches below it, and you'll get that with a little bit of practice. Let's do one more time. Knit, slip into the knit stitch as if to purl, and then purl, slip it off, come between the 2 stitches and go in as if to knit. As you can see, I've now worked all the way across my row to my final pair of stitches. This is not enough stitches to be able to do the same set of stages as we have been doing thus far, so we do a slightly reduced version. Just as before, we go into the first knit stitch as if to knit, and we slip that stitch off the needle. Then straight away we go into the final stitch as if to purl, and we also slip that one off the needle, then just pull through, not allowing it to wrap around itself, and tighten everything up. Then you can break that yarn, leaving enough of a tail to weave in your edges. And here's how it looks. We've got our Kitchener graft all done on one needle only, without having to separate any of the stitches. And I think you'll agree, there we are, nice and stretchy too. I think you'll agree it's the perfect match to our cast on edge, and both edges match up very, very nicely. A little bit of a hand block or a steam block just to keep everything really, really tidy. I had a little bit of a tension blip there, but yours will be much, much more perfect than that because you're not doing it through a camera lens. And there we are, the one needle Kitchener bind off.